Hello and welcome to our seventh webinar in our series about performance, the lives of actors. You're joining us for episode 7, How Do You Shake It Off After Performance? I'm Dr. Mark Seaton, and I'm delighted to have as my special guest Dr. Cheryl McFarren, who's the Associate Professor from Denison University in Granville, Ohio. Before we make a start and explore the theme for today, just a reminder that if you'd like to continue to generate conversation around the lives of actors, you can use the hashtag Lives of Actors, and you can follow me on Twitter at Sense Connection. Also, if you're watching this live, you can participate in the chat by typing in questions where it is on your panel. Write your message here. And if you click on the little thought bubble, it'll give you an option between chat and ask a question. So if possible, if you can select to ask a question, then that will appear clearly as a question that we can address as we proceed. If the opportunity fits for us to ask a question mid-flow in the interview, I'll do that. But if I feel it's a question we may save to the end, then I'll do that as well. The format is that I'll interview Cheryl first about her chapter on this experience of the destabilizing of identity through the experiences of enacting trauma on stage, and then we'll open up for questions. But for now, I'm going to bring us back to myself on screen. There we are. And now I'm going to introduce Cheryl to you. Hello, Cheryl, and welcome.
Hello, Mark. Nice to be with you this evening. Well, it's evening where I am.
It is, and it's morning where we are, but it's great to have you with us. Thanks for your time. Cheryl, before we get into questions around your chapter, perhaps you'd like to tell us all a bit about what you're currently doing. Maybe there's some projects that you have coming up.
Yes, well, we're about to start the school year. This is my 7th year at Denison University, and class begins on Thursday of this week. And Friday night, we'll have auditions for the Trojan Women. So we start right in.
That's great.
So I will be directing this fall and teaching 2 courses, and looking forward to perhaps doing some acting later in the year. But my position as a teacher is mostly that I get my students to do the acting, and I do it as my scholarship, my research.
And that's Cheryl, remind me that we also need to acknowledge at this point that we were hoping to have Jane Griffiths with us as well, another academic and performer. And unfortunately, technology, maybe in Australia, we weren't able to make the successful connection today. However, I've spoken with Jane, and we will arrange another time to have her share her work with us. And hopefully we'll actually have Cheryl contribute to a conversation around her work as well. So it would be great, yes. So Cheryl, you open your chapter, and we'll be giving a link to everyone at the end where they can purchase the book and read this chapter amongst the others. You open your chapter with a recollection of a story that's recorded supposedly about the ancient Greek actor Polus and his experience of creating an authentic performance. Perhaps you might like to start by recounting that story, because I think it sets a great context for your own experience as a performer.
Well, I had encountered this story perhaps for the first time myself as an undergraduate, perhaps in a theater history class. The sort of emblematic, legendary story of an actor who, needing to cry, to experience grief on stage, brings in an urn that he has filled with the actual ashes of his dead son. Simon Goldhill, in his book, How to Stage Greek Tragedy Today, puts it rather well. He says, Polus was in the play Electra by Sophocles, And he says, in Sophocles' play, Electra laments over the urn with unbearable feeling. Her syntax collapses, the verse form breaks down, and eventually even the otherwise brutally unemotional Orestes collapses and confesses to her his real identity. Paulus shockingly filled the urn with the ashes of his recently dead son before he played Electra. The performance went down in Greek history as one of the most moving ever for actor and audience alike. Paulus turned public theater into a form of public ritual of mourning, and the uncanny breaking of the conditions of theatrical illusion in this of all scenes contributed to the powerful effect of Paulus's tears. I wish I'd quoted that in the paper. I think that's a better quote.
Yeah.
But the idea is of course that he is so visibly grief-stricken that it is the authenticity of his emotion that invites the authenticity of the audience's response. It's a bit problematic too, which we'll get into, no doubt.
Yes, we will indeed. So it's a great opening, I think, for your chapter because of the challenges around. Is that what we all have to do as performers to create that reality? So I know from our previous conversations and writings together that this that you have a bit of a background to looking at this question about the challenges of drawing upon personal experience for performative experience. Perhaps you could give us some of that context that informs your awareness of the challenges around this.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, and I think I'm particularly interested in how this can play out in a situation where the performer has curtailed agency. So, for instance, in the setting where a teacher, professor is doing the directing and awarding a grade to a performer who is an undergraduate, there's a power differential that I think is important to note. So I've been very interested in these issues, the issue of agency and of use of self, since I myself was in an undergraduate, and my dissertation, in fact, was inspired, if you can call it that, by the fact that I had a particularly searing moment in my undergraduate education where a professor of acting had me do an affective memory exercise, working privately with him on a Saturday afternoon or something like that. And I felt so vulnerable at the end of that experience because I had used, well, it's worth perhaps telling the whole story. I was doing Hermione in The Winter's Tale, and probably, doing it to the best of my undergraduate ability, which was to say quite generally. And, tears have always been easy for me to summon. But he wanted me to be far more specific. And so he asked me to think of the worst thing that had ever been said to me. And as a young adult, I went right for that. I knew exactly what it was, and I know who said it. And when he asked me to hear this person saying it in my brain, I could do that. And then he asked me to hear an entire tribunal chanting it, and to see the face of the person who had said this to me on the faces of the members of the tribunal. And I began to sob. I was in the memory of that painful experience. I would call it a flashback for sure. I was, sort of immobilized by that memory. And then he said, now start your piece, which I did. And at the end of that, feeling really that I had walked to the edge of sanity. That's how I experienced it as a young person. He said, "Wow, if you do it just that way, I know you'll get into Juilliard." Well, and I thought in that moment, as I'm trying to get over having had a nervous breakdown in his presence, I thought, I'm never doing that again. That was not good. I don't know what that was, but that was too scary. That was too frightening. And of course, when I went to the audition for Juilliard, I was completely in my head, couldn't use any of it.
Yeah.
So I have been interested in the idea of to what extent actors use themselves, and particularly use traumatic memories, particularly when there are issues of power, because it informs my work as I teach undergraduates. So for me, the Paulus's story, that idea of the intersection of the real and the fictional, set up the experience of my encounter in 2012.
Yeah.
The subject of my article.
Yeah, that's terrific. Thank you for sharing that, because I'm very conscious it's always something we need to honor when people share their personal stories around the experiences, which are quite vulnerable and traumatizing. And I particularly appreciate your distinction also between there's the vulnerability on the one hand, just in and of itself, connecting with those deep and meaningful real feelings, and then being asked to transpose them into a fictional context. And I think related but distinct from is the context in which you're asked to do that, where there is an inequality of power, where you are being expected to do this because this is the teacher, you are the student, and there's no room for negotiation, whereas you might have some more room for negotiation in the rehearsal room, hypothetically, if the director is open to that discussion. And in fact, we'll find that out as we look further at your experience in this chapter. So I might then go to the fact that I really appreciated your quote from Rhonda Brown, where she says, all performance is ultimately about how images in somebody's head work on the body of the performer and the audience. And so with that quote about this, how the fictional has a real impact on bodies of both performers and audience, how is that informing your approach to creating character? And does it also impact on the way that you teach your students to create character?
Yes, I think it does, because what that marvelous idea does for me is to free me from my autobiography. That the idea that the imaginative, the experienced vicariously, all of those sorts of ways that we accrue experience can be honored in performing, that it doesn't have to be limited or doesn't have to be revealed that is my, that is authentically me. So, and I think this is true for the audience as well, that, what we're trying, we're all invested in that fiction, that the story that we're trying to tell. And it is so valid to get the audience to imagine what has occurred, to move them to that rather than to tell them what to feel or to think. So this, I think the images, the image stream that Rhonda Brown talks about is extremely valuable. And I try to sensitize my students to the ways in which the playwright has assisted them in creating circumstances and ideas that are going to produce those images, and that they can, to a certain extent, allow those things to do the work for them.
And I think that's really a key thing, because you're actually moving away from trying to this thing to create reality, rather than recognizing that any creative work is to some extent artificial. It's a shaping of events that may indeed be real once, historically real or true, but are now being crafted. And it's that crafting which moves an audience, not the fact that it's real or historically accurate or whatever, but how it's crafted by the performer, by the writers, by the design, and so on. That's a really great insight, I think, to reinforce there.
And it's also wonderfully, it honors both the individual interpretation of the performer or of the individual audience member, but it also is a communal experience. So I think what is sort of absent in that is this is a sort of ego that reduces large images to sort of individual narratives that may or may not be very interesting. But if you're young, you think you're interesting. You know, I was young once too.
And so was I. Yes, so was. And I think also, I think that interesting thing of, you know, this need to be authentic, and one can be perhaps authentic without having to be seen to be historical or autobiographical, in the sense that there's still an authenticity even when you are engaging with a fiction. How you as a performer respond to that fiction is certainly can be authentic, and that it's a genuine response to it, but doesn't necessarily have to be attached to your own personal history or biography.
Absolutely.
So why don't we now, Cheryl, look to the context in which you wrote this? You wrote this piece, this chapter rather, drawing, as we acknowledge, as auto-ethnographic, so writing about the experience and reflecting on your experience of rehearsal and performance, and a performance called Ghostwriter.
That's right.
I might bring up some images now from that performance. You might like to tell us a bit about the story, the outline of the plot, so that we can then, and your role in that. So I'll while you start to tell the story, I'll bring up the images of that.
Great. Well, the story is a 2012 play, Ghostwriter, by Michael Hollinger. And it tells, the play tells the story of, well, the title of the play is a pun, I guess I can give away. Yeah. Myra, who is featured there on the left, played by Renee Prince, is a young woman, a new woman at the turn of the 20th century, who is a typist. And she has come for a job to work with Franklin Woolsey, who is played by John Arp on the right. The writer Woolsey is a fictional creation modeled a bit on Henry James, especially because James did indeed dictate his novels to typists. And in a strange experience, one of them, Theodora Busanke, I don't know if that's actually how you say her name, Theodora had reported continuing to hear Henry James's dictation after his death. So she actually completed writing a novel for him after his death. So she is engaging in the work of writing with Woolsey, and she also continues that work after the writer dies, and he does die about 2/3 of the way through the play. Now, who do I play, or who did I play? Well, I played Wolsey's wife. And Wolsey's wife, Vivian, is lonely. She used to transcribe his books by hand, and she used to do that in their home. And it suggested that they had some type of romantic relationship at one point in their marriage, but that has faded away, and she has now become a somewhat nagging wife. She's controlling. She wants to make sure that Wolsey is where he says he is. She's jealous of the attention that he pays to Myra. And so she gets him in this scene that we're seeing. This is the second scene of the play, to go to lunch with people who are going to get a telephone put in his studio, so she won't have to come all the way up the stairs. But she can keep tabs on him. So at several points in the play, the phone rings, and Myra and Wolsey decide to or not to answer the phone. So that's interesting. And after Wolsey dies, which is indicated by just a sound, a thud, Vivian comes late at night back to the studio to tell Myra to cease and desist. Myra has continued work on the unfinished novel, the novel that Wolsey has died before completing, and essentially threatens her, tells her if she finds out that Myra is a fraud, she will have the novel burnt. And clearly she feels that this novel is almost a bastard child. She says, I won't have that bastard novel in my home, much less mocking me from the bookstalls. And so this thing that happens at the very end of the play is essentially the premise for the whole play. We find out that Vivian has hired someone to investigate whether Myra continues to hear Wolsey. So we, the audience, witness Wolsey throughout the play. Even after his death, you see him there on the stage. So is it or is it not legitimate? Is she writing from the ghost, or is she a ghost writer? That's
great.
the play.
Yes. So that's the project in which you were involved in, and what your paper though also notes is there were some real life circumstances that happened just prior to going into rehearsal. Would you like to share those now?
Yes. So I agreed to this role somewhere around May 14th, I think it was, of 2012. So I said the play was written in 2012. I'm wrong. It was written in 2011. All of this happened in 2012. So June 6th of 2012, my father died. Suddenly, he expressed some diffuse back pain and simply collapsed at home. And I received a call late in the evening. This was in California, so many miles away from my home in Ohio, that my father was gone. And began the work of rehearsal in July, late July, as I recall. And so I had been at home in California, in my childhood home, sort of putting away my father's effects, trying to help my mother, a woman not unlike Vivian Wolsey in some ways. So and very much experiencing vicariously what it might be to be a widow because I was there. I'm my mother's oldest daughter, so I had this sort of familial responsibility that I was carrying out or enacting at home just before I went into rehearsal. And then Wolsey in the play dies in a way that's very similar to the way that my father died. He complains, instead of diffuse back pain, he talks about a ringing in his ears and then simply collapses. And I was very struck by the similarity of that experience, and talk about that in the article, that very early on in the rehearsal process, I was able to share, well, I wasn't able to, I was sort of compelled to share with the ensemble that I didn't think that that was a stroke at all. I thought it was an aneurysm. And the reason I thought it was an aneurysm was because it so resembled the way that my father had just recently died. And so I say that now rather dispassionately. I've told the story sometimes. I would be lying to say that I experience it dispassionately. I don't. But I've gained mastery over the telling of the story.
Yes.
That it was a very emotional moment, because the rest of the ensemble, there was only one person in the room who actually knew where I had been prior to joining the company. They had been producing 7 other shows that summer. I joined them for the very last one. So, to sort of gain access to this community, and then to sort of reveal that while you all have been having fun, I've been staging a memorial service and giving my father's clothes away, because was a very it was a strange tension in the room. And as one of the stage managers said, he said, "Yes, I remember that moment as the moment I thought to myself, shit just got real." So, we're really doing a play about death.
Yeah. Which I think is powerful and really valuable, that when we tell stories, when we do plays, we are telling the stories of our lives as human beings. And so there's that very real connectedness for you in taking on this role. And you actually made a choice to continue to take this role, given that you had just experienced all these personal upheavals, really dramatic upheavals in your own life and in your family's life. So it's that crucial commitment that you were very, as you say in the chapter, very aware of what was at stake, even as you decided to commit to doing the rehearsal and the performance process. Others might well understand if you had said, no, this is the wrong time to do this now.
Yeah, right. I perhaps should have done that. In some ways, I think that that would have been a very reasonable response. I see in retrospect, I had every that would have been a very safe thing to do, but I didn't know that then. And I think in many ways, my father would really have, he was quite a quiet and humble person. I'm not sure he would have wanted me not to do what I loved to do. So I think I overestimated my ability to cope with those upheavals.
Right.
But it turned out to be quite a profound experience, and in some ways a very cathartic one, because I was aware of my grief as I was rehearsing, aware of when it was negatively impacting the experience, when as I say in the article, when I was bringing the real ashes onto the stage, as opposed to the imagined or the metaphorical or the imagistic things that I might have brought. So and I think, if I can just say, it was very healing for me to write this article, in that I realized upon completing it, because as you know, I had a difficult time completing it, that I was holding on to, I think, guilt that I had in fact been able to use the fact of my father's death in such a productive way. I think I felt guilty about that on some level. And what I realized ultimately was that was kind of stupid, that it wasn't, well, it wasn't, I speak in hyperbolic ways sometimes. Apologies to those at home. if you're typing in a comment about, please stop. But I realized that I shouldn't, it was kind of immaterial to feel guilty about him dying, that really I should feel grateful that he lived and that he was my father, because he encouraged so many wonderful things in me, including now I'm going to get all verklempt, including the ability to feel greatly.
Yeah.
So once I had that experience of, oh, I'm feeling perhaps something that is not useful and not even correct, I was able to finish the article. So I got through my writer's block and had a sense of closure several years after performing this role. It stayed with me that long.
And I'm so glad you're able to complete the article so that we can all share in the gift that you received and, in a sense, pass on. So I find that's really encouraging. And to me, that demonstrates that there's the craft in rehearsing and performing, and then there's the craft in reflecting and writing about that rehearsing and performing. That is another artistic and personal, interpersonal opportunity for new insights and new experiences. So thank you for sharing in that journey with us.
Thank you for being patient with me as I completed it. But I think, I think you're absolutely right. And I'm not sure that certainly actors in this country have not really been encouraged to reflect on their experiences, or to help those of us who teach provide the lived experience that is so very valuable for students. So I want to recognize just how essential that feels, how rich that feels to engage in that reflection. And I think we could have another chat about the reasons why people can't do that. Survival is one of them.
Yeah.
But I think that I'm not unique in having a story. No. I just wrote it. And so did Jane, which is, the other thing that I am very excited about this particular volume that you've put together, because you've assembled numerous stories, numerous voices reflecting on our lives in ways that I'm not sure we've been encouraged to do. So thank you for that.
Oh, delighted. And yes, I'm biased, of course. I'm one of the co-editors of this publication. So, but if people hadn't responded to our offer, we wouldn't have this publication. So there's a sense of a community saying that it's time for us to feel safe to share and to take a risk, to have a bit of courage around sharing these things so that we can all learn and grow through that. And in fact, it's pertinent that I guess reference now Terence Crawford when he shared with us, particularly his questions around his experience as an actor, often coming into the rehearsal process after often the director and often the designer had purportedly done all the work, and now they're just bringing the actors to kind of fill in the gaps. He saw it was very challenging for actors to insert their own creativity and artistic craft in collaboration with the director and the set designer and the costume designer. How did you find yourself being able to contribute to this particular rehearsal process? I know in the article you make reference to the collaboration you had with actors, with the director, and also with costume. Maybe I'd like to talk about some of those experiences.
Yes, well, I would say that from the very beginning, one of the things that I found the most inspiring were the costume renderings, or was the costume renderings. The costume designer Tatiana de Pavlov, I think is her name. She had, working collaboratively with Nagel Jackson, the director, she had done some wonderful renderings that showed to me a couple of things that I had missed even in reading the script closely. I had sort of missed that my character, Vivian Woolsey, was the only one who ever left the stage. And thus the passage of time was my responsibility to show. So she made a point of showing me these 3 dresses that Vivian would wear during the play. And she called it the parade. And that was just that sort of sense of being on a float, of showing off to a certain extent, of compensating for this lack of security that she felt in her marriage, perhaps, was very rich as a notion, and helped imaginatively at the beginning of the process, but really helped when we got on stage and into the latter stages of rehearsal. And as I say in the article, because she had given this sort of string of costumes a title, the parade, I had the opportunity to say, hey, can the parade continue? Because I would really rather not bow in my 3rd dress. My 3rd dress is mourning clothes, and I've done enough mourning this summer for a lifetime. Thank you very much. I would rather put something else on. And since it's in keeping with the character and I have time, might we do this some other way? And she spoke to the director, and the director approved that, and that allowed me to sort of step out of this thing that felt very confining. Well, and Vivian leaves very shaken, having made this threat about burning the bastard novel. I wanted to just be able to enjoy the audience's response at the end and not still be resonating with all of the sadness of my last exit. So it was very, very helpful for me. And I say too that Nagel Jackson was a dream to work with. He has been a performer and director in this country for many, many years, and he was so considerate of actors' processes and easy does it. He would end rehearsal if he thought we got to a good place. He never pushed us. He just very gently shaped the play and let us find it. he would often give notes privately, so nobody ever got their backs up. You know,
Yeah.
It was just a really, he treated us as mature creative artists and allowed us to bring our ideas and our personal lives into the play. And that was one of the best experiences I've ever had as a performer. It was delightful.
That's wonderful, and I think it's just valuable just to hear that for those who will be watching this program either live or in replay, is that such an inter-cooperative, interdependent, respectful, mature adult-to-adult production process does happen, can happen, and we could be teaching the next generation of directors that it can happen as well, rather than either watch or experience other models that are less than supportive of the creative process for all parties, not just for the director or the designer, but for the actors as well.
I was so intrigued by the way that Nagel worked in rehearsal. He simply observed. And he might take a note here or there, but, you know, he wasn't scribbling on pages and pages. He'd sort of assess the situation. You know, it was as if he asked, what is the one thing, one significant thing that I can say to Cheryl or John or Renee today that's going to resonate with them and help them do this work. So it was, he never got in our way. But he was so judicious about the things he said. I mentioned in the article that because of where I was emotionally, brought lots of emotion into lots of the play. And Nagel, after allowing me to do that for several days, took me aside very privately and said, I think that this can happen one time. Where is that time? And while I got a little neurotic about that note, might be more of a reflection on me than on him, but it allowed me to find that climactic moment and to really to use my own instincts as a performer to understand that. And so that was just really gratifying. He also Renee and I, when we played this confrontation scene, it was never the same twice. It was but it was always good. You know, we were always really listening and responding, but the blocking changed. And, you know, but at one point, Nagel said to us, I love watching this scene. It is never the same twice. And, you know, responding in such an affirmative way gave us permission to continue investing in this very difficult scene. We didn't feel we ever had to set it to such a degree that it would get old or stale. So that was very, very, very helpful.
Yeah. Sounds like a great model director that we
yes.
steer around a bit more. It's very
and
positive.
A playwright. He's a playwright too.
Right. And a performer. So that possibly informs why he is sensitive to the whole dynamics of the creative process, to trust that others understand that process as well and can journey with that. So that's really great.
And, you know, he has some life experience too, which I think is, you know, when you have had a long career and you still love doing what you do, there's lots of wisdom that gets imparted. And in fact, I don't think I said this in the article, but I had been watching Nagel's work since I was probably about 13 at American Conservatory Theater in San Francisco when I was a child, and later at the Denver Center when I was a graduate student. And I told him this, I think he was horrified. I said, you know, working with you has been on my bucket list. Didn't sign on to the play because it meant working with Nagel. That was just, I didn't even ask who was directing. I don't know what I didn't think this through, but it was such a treat to work with him and understand why the friends who had worked with him over the years had been so generous in their praise, because I certainly shared that kind of experience in this piece.
Mm. So when you are in the process of both the rehearsal and then into the performance, I know you acknowledge that it's really important to have support from your fellow cast members as each of you creates that new persona to inhabit, as you shared, you know, in that final confrontational scene, that you were free to work off each other in a fresh way each time. Is that understanding explicit or implicit? Are there times when you felt it was or could be more useful to be more explicit? And do the director and other personnel contribute into that risk-taking and so on?
I think in this particular situation, it was a bit more implicit, and that the collaboration that I experienced with Renee was what it was because of who she is as a person and performer. And Nagel never really insisted that we all have that kind of attitude or way of interacting. To be supportive of John, who played Wolsey, sometimes meant not engaging him, allowing him a little bit more space. I mean, both he and Myra, Wolsey and Myra, have the lion's share of the dialogue, and it seemed that John was more interested in producing his performance technically. He was also playing several different large roles that summer, this being just one of many. So I think he was, you know, trying to keep the the various roles straight. He is a chef too, and I think that's kind of where he was headed. He was sort of leaving the theater at that point and going towards this new interest. It wasn't particularly new, but he was getting ready. He's just now opened a restaurant next to the theater in Creed. Oh. So he really did go there. You know, so there was this this wonderful, very heartfelt engagement with Renee, and with John, it was something different. Though I was playing his wife, he was much more private, I think, about his process, and not quite as interested in vulnerability, perhaps.
Right. Yeah. So that's really, I think, useful to know, because sometimes when people think about how do you create an ideal production where everybody is on the same page, well, they're all on the same page production-wise, and they all have some sort of investment in the project. Otherwise, they may be taking away from it. But they will have different levels of openness, of engagement, depending on where they are in their careers, as you say.
That's right. And to be supportive of his work, he wanted different things from us than Renee or I wanted at that point, and probably she and I wanted somewhat similar things, and so we had a wonderful friendship relationship. She could be my daughter, really, and our relationship was a bit. Mother-daughter in the best of senses, maternal in that way. But it was still a very collaborative experience. Yeah,
that's great. Yeah, we might then now move on to the kind of, I guess, part of the core of your article, which is making that distinction between the artistic requirements or constraints of a scene and finding that spontaneity or authenticity in the character. Perhaps you'd like to share about the creative and or personal tensions that are managed in
yes, creating the marriage on stage.
On stage, yeah,
can be a little awkward. Yes, well. Perhaps because of his distance, his seeming to be a bit, I want to say removed, but that's not it, reserved, I guess. And because I was by myself in Creede, Colorado, which is a very tiny town, and and because the death of Wolsey approximated what I understood to be my father's death, I got very confused about what my relationship was with John. That in fact, I began to feel attracted to him in ways that were not helpful to me, and probably not to him either. And it, sort of being professional, having appropriate professional boundaries, became just kind of frightening, because I didn't know what those were for a little while, and I'm very fortunate that we all survived, and it was all a sort of imagined dalliance, because but it was more, it wasn't a dalliance, it was a confusion, and a need for to be comforted during this time of grief. And so yeah, I emerged from it very confused and wondering what just hit me. Is it that I'm not in my marriage? Am I in my marriage? Who am I? And so I, that was part of part of why this role lingered for me. But he's also a very charming person, a good actor. He's a handsome guy. I mean, what's not to like? But,
you're human beings.
Yeah, we're human beings. But he's available and I'm not. So I was just struck by that, because I know better. I teach this stuff, and yet here my body was doing things without my consent. Sort of, it was as if, he he had touched me and the impression of his fingers lingered on my body. It was as if that had happened. That didn't happen. You know, but it occurred to me, why is intimacy on stage between two individuals something that we permit, we cultivate, we rehearse, we want it to look the way that it should?
Yeah.
But you leave that rehearsal hall and you still have the experience of that. But if you were to reenact that in real life, suddenly that's no longer okay. And negotiating what was real and what was fiction was, for a time, very difficult for me. I'm sort of humbled to say, because it was such a deep human, crazy thing to have happen.
Yeah, and to me, thank you, Cheryl. That for me was one of the particularly powerful aspects of your article, that openness you shared with the readership around that identity confusion and the journey you took, which you articulate really well in the article.
Good, because I don't think I did it very well then.
I think we got a different sense of it then, which is great, because I like, that's the quality of the live, as distinct from maybe the rehearsed and reconstructed in the written form. So they both are valuable. And for me, when I hear you articulate that, that so powerfully resonates with my feelings and my own personal experience, but also my perception of what is not often talked about is these experiences of confusion, and that's, I think, an unavoidable thing, because what we do, whether it's on a stage or off a stage, is real and embodied, even if it is framed either for the audience or in the moment that we're acting a fiction, and it's a reality because it's happening with real bodies. There are always real bodies in the room, and right. Even on the screen there are real bodies. So exactly. That's part of my own going rationale for why we need to keep talking about these things, and not fall prone to maybe making poor choices out of that sense of confusion, which is what you were very conscious not to make poor choices and change your relationship in that way. So I might then take us then to look at this notion that's often used, actually, to say, well, if you know how to use a mask, if you take off the mask, then you should have no problems. I think actually what we've just talked about demonstrates that even when you take off the mask, what you had was a real experience, even if it was framed in the fiction of being behind the mask of the character. So you do recognize that there's a practical use for masks, and you use masks with your students as often it's used as a tool for distancing yourself from the character. How much do you think mask is this imaginative tool for playing with the consciousness, and also for allowing new possibilities to emerge in the playing of roles or personas?
I love the fact that the mask, that actual masks sometimes take us in very unexpected directions, and that sort of almost anarchic experience of putting on a character mask can liberate some really extraordinary creative impulses that we might censor were we not in mask. And I think that that the mask, by masking the face, we have to get the bodies into it. That the rest of the body becomes activated in a way that you can't just do with eye contact. And especially for beginning actors, I find it very useful to demonstrate that with them. And I preface my response with that because I feel that it wasn't until really I realized that Vivian's mask was, maybe it was threefold, you know, that she wore 3 different masks in the play. And the one that I understood coming to the play was this last one, but I had to find the other 2 moments. I mean, that's one scene out of the play. It's perhaps, you know, it's a smaller scene in the last third of the play. There was a story to be told before that. How was I going to get there? And I think the mask is useful to think of as a metaphor when I realized that I was sort of refusing to put it on. There was a stage direction, or not a stage direction, but a given circumstance in the play that I had written off. I am so, more humility from me, mea culpa. There's a note, Wolsey makes a dig to Myra about his wife when he says, Myra and Wolsey are, at least in Myra's mind, dancing at one point. And he says to her, I would have brought a record from home, but most of Mrs. Wolsey's collection are Sousa records. And I thought, John Philip Sousa, ew. I was like, that's mean. That's mean. I'm not going to use that. That said, to me, that said something about the dysfunction in their marriage, and he was putting her down and maybe scoring points with his, you know, this woman who understood him better. And for me, later in the process, I realized what a beautiful, not only joke, but what a beautiful possibility was embedded in that line, because there was a sort of martial nature that I could use as Vivian Woolsey, particularly in the first scene where Mrs. Woolsey sort of pushes her way in unexpected to have an interview with her husband's new typist. She's made sure that Woolsey is out of the office, and she's come in to sort of let her know who's boss. And so I imagined that, you know, not only was it Sousa marches, she particularly liked the cymbals crashing, you know. And for me, you know, standing in the wings, thinking through the opening to the Stars and Stripes Forever gave me this sense of bearing that gave me a wonderful moment before and a different energy on the stage. And so that idea of, again, the difference between my own personal autobiographical sense of this, it was so limiting, where the mask of the line that the playwright had given us all was so full of possibility that it would have been a real shame for me to reduce Vivian to Cheryl's own reading of it. I'm so glad that I caught Michael's gist, Michael Hollinger's gist.
Yes. Yeah, and it strikes, I find also useful, your discussion of mask is your encouraging us to think of, there may be several masks that you perform during the course of the one story, because different qualities, different shapes about the character need to be accentuated, again, for the artistic purpose of the story.
Right.
And to shape it in that particular way. In fact, the way you talk about mask reminds me of the way I often talking with characters about, they have their own actors as human beings, have their own preferences, their own default shape, but they need to discover the shapes that are required of the storytelling, which they may want to keep parts of those shapes in their life afterwards. And other right. They'll want to let go of and throw away and say, no, that's a shape I don't need to carry on in my life, but I did experiment with it, I did play with it. So It's yes, I think it moves us beyond that notion of mask being one fixed mask for the whole show, which is perhaps a default that some people think of.
Yeah, and perhaps back to the Greeks. I mean, if you think
Yes.
of the individual actor wearing more than one mask so he can play more than one character, you know,
Yes.
that's, I mean, we've been doing this, we've been doing this for a long time here in the West. And, yeah, I think that's I think it's a very helpful image, particularly for student actors who may feel so protective of themselves. The mask liberates them to demonstrate things that they didn't necessarily know were possible or possibilities for them. And I think that that's very exciting. That can be very exciting to witness.
Yeah. So as we come towards the end of our formal question time, then we'll see if there's some questions from those watching. We spoke earlier of that sense of distance that you might create artistically by taking on and taking off mask. But you also talk about the importance of negotiating distance between the characterization and your own ongoing life as an actor. And you mentioned the work of Robert Landy, a drama therapist. Would you like to say a bit about what's significant about his approach to drama and how this notion of distancing, how he understands that?
Well, yes, there was a while there that I thought I wanted to be a drama therapist. And in that early time of study, I studied briefly with Renee Amuna in San Francisco, and then for a longer time with Sue Jennings in England. And Landy came up in both of those courses. And I was drawn to this idea of, he's borrowed it, he's refined it from the sociologist Thomas Scheff. But this idea that a human being can't, or a character, because characters are often human beings, can be, you know, someone who is immersed in and can be all the way on a spectrum from immersion in a particular experience or emotion to completely removed from it. And I thought that I loved that spectrum because it helped me understand that in much of my life, my approach to, you know, I've always had a very thin skin. You know, that was something my dad would always say to me. He said, I just wish your skin would toughen up. It still hasn't, but I've learned to work with it perhaps more productively. And mind you, my son is also very sensitive. So that's, you know, poor guy. But, you know, I realized that my life was spent sort of closer to the end of what we would call underdistance, that there's insufficient distance between my experience of something and the thing itself. Where, as I was describing, John's portrayal or his desire to perform, or perhaps just his approach to life, is a little more towards the end of the spectrum, that certainly farther over from mine, that you would call overdistance. And in the middle is what we call aesthetic distance. It's the appropriate amount of distance between the experience of thinking and feeling, thinking on this side and feeling on this side. It is sometimes our experience of our own feelings with it, or thoughts within our heads. We can identify or detach. We talk about those things. And so it was very helpful for me to realize that I'm over here, but that's not the only position on the spectrum. And that, in fact, this was helpful when I worked with affective memory, because the affective memory exercise was created, well, it wasn't created, but was really instituted by Lee Strasberg, who I believe was sort of on this overdistanced end of the spectrum. And so it was a way to bring him and people who were unable to feel closer to their feelings. I don't know that he was unable to feel, but, you know, if they had any sort of difficulty expressing, it brought them closer to that. It created what he called real, you know, or true. But you take that experience and you hand it to somebody like me, I who feel everything. And as happened to me in college, I go off the deep end. You know, I don't need to get any closer to what I'm feeling. I need to get further away from it in order for it to be artistic.
Yes.
And that's, so Landy is talking about it not only from an aesthetic point of view, but also he talks about, and Sheff talks about, the idea that the point of aesthetic distance is also the point of catharsis. That at that central point where things are poised and balanced, we have equal amounts of thinking and feeling, and we can feel something without being overwhelmed by it. So the therapeutic benefit can be achieved at that point of aesthetic distance, which was revolutionary for somebody like me who'd spent most of her life over here. You know, I need to, if I'm going to be artful and have the impact that I want to have, I have to gain some distance. So, so thank you, Robert Landy, for helping me to learn about myself in a way that has provided me with a tool to achieve distance and to advocate for myself as a performer.
And what I think you're actually have the potential to advocate, which I know you have done in your writings, is you're actually advocating for many other performers who find themselves also a very highly sensitive person who needs to understand how to manage that aesthetic distance when they too might be approached by a person like a Strasberg, or using Strasberg or others models for actor training, thinking they're doing a great service to unleash the actor, when in fact they're traumatizing the particular actor. And
yes, and I would clarify too.
Yeah,
because, you know, I'm going to get Strasberg hate mail.
Let's not do that.
He does still have living family members,
Yes.
but I would say that it's perhaps the most dangerous thing is re-traumatizing someone, because I'm not sure that it would traumatize someone who had not already experienced trauma. Yeah. It's just that the way trauma is contained in the brain, in the synapses, you can't do that exercise without going full bore back into a traumatic memory. And the fact that Lee Strasberg said that 7 years, you should never use a memory more recent than 7 years old. Well, there's no statute of limitations on a traumatic memory. You know, we can only hope that we begin to metabolize it in a different way. But so I want to be careful not to accuse them of being,
absolutely.
Because I'm very hard on him anyway. So.
And as you say, he has over the years copped a lot of criticism, and then there have been many people then saying they're misrepresenting what he was about. And I think it's always important that we honor each person in their historical and social and cultural context. And
absolutely,
for many people, it's very liberating and powerful. And we now have Dustin Hoffman running an online training program and very much drawing on the heritage of Strasbourg, but with a different take and a different ethos around that, I suspect. I haven't looked at the program myself. So it's an ongoing debate around the different models of actor training. Perhaps what we actually need more of is maybe not so much debate around models of actor training, but more careful reflection on the kinds of people who are drawn into actor training. And
that's a good point.
And what is the openness, the vulnerability, the ability to self-regulate one's emotions along that spectrum, that continuum that you described of Robert Landis. So there may be some more conversations we need to have in acting institutions about the screening in auditions, perhaps, to not stop people from coming into acting, but to be aware that there are as many different bodies and psyches that come into actor training that will need appropriate support and care so that they can make a rich and powerful contribution to the profession.
Yes.
Yeah. So, well, we're coming now towards the end of our time together. And so if there are any questions that those watching may like to bring or comments, please do so. But I'll bring my last question, if I may, which actually picks up on this theme of catharsis. You've just described how it was a really helpful tool of Landis to position you in a deeper sense. And you also mentioned in your article there was value in actually having some psychotherapy after the experience of doing this production. I wondered if you may like to talk a bit about where you see it's valuable to perhaps access psychotherapy. It's something that does come up in conversations around as a strategy for self-care of actors. What role you think it might play?
Well, I'm somebody who has always been very helped by hearing her thoughts aloud. So it is easier for me to process experience verbally than perhaps any other way. And in my experience, a good therapist listens carefully and reflects back the things that he or she is hearing, and does that with an attention, a prizing of the individual who's present. So they are solely focused. Actors, the therapist is solely focused on you.
Remember that.
What could be greater? I mean, isn't that what we hope for? That a whole audience is going to be riveted on us. But it is, but those questions, that seeking that we often do, can find a real home in a very direct manner in psychotherapy, so that I have great agency over changing my mask in through a psychotherapeutic process. I mean, I can see reflected back to me where I am perhaps being harder on myself than I need to be. Well, once I have that piece of awareness, I can decide to change it, or to continue running up against it, or to realize that this is a leitmotif in the music of my life. So I've been fortunate to have several very helpful therapists at various times for various different reasons. When I returned from working on Ghostwriter, I really wanted to know what just happened to me. Does this attraction to someone else, even though it was not consummated in any way, is my marriage in danger? What really is grief? Have I gone through mourning having just had this experience? What what is all of this? And ultimately, I'll share with you all that what my therapist said at that point was, the death of your father precipitated a rather existential crisis.
Wow.
And, does that mean it's the end of your marriage? Probably not. Time will tell, but it should. You loved your father and you lost him suddenly.
That's powerful. Yeah.
I mean, and I was like, well, thank you. Thank you for honoring the fact that this enormous life experience happened to me, and I was so busy trying to learn my lines and to do other things that perhaps I didn't recognize how much of a change that would make.
Yeah. No, thank you, Cheryl. And it strikes me also that there's a value of the psychotherapist that you don't have with family members or other significant others, either professionally or interpersonally, because, as you say, in that amusing way, it's all about me.
Right.
For the psychotherapist.
Right. They've had to go through training. Hopefully they've got unpacked their own things, and they can focus on me.
But they also bring, as you say, expertise hopefully, if they're a good therapist, expertise as a good listener, a good reflector, and they bring the wisdom of human experience that when there are crises in life, everything is up for grabs, but it doesn't mean that everything has to go. And that was what, in a sense, was your therapist's good counsel there. And I guess I'd be interested in your thoughts. Sometimes it's suggested that your director might be the person you might talk to process things after a performance, or maybe a separate acting coach separate from the director. But it sounds to me, but you may agree or disagree with one or the other, or maybe it does need to have someone who's actually totally removed from the whole performance scene. What are your thoughts on that?
I suppose it might be any of those people, depending on the relationship. I think I would, I guess I would find it a little more difficult to process these sorts of things with a director, because I think their goals are different. They're not necessarily about the growth of an individual actor, except perhaps in terms of the story that's being told. Now, there may be differences if you've worked with a person frequently and you have a rapport with them, that might be different. But I would say that I would encourage my students not to necessarily do that with a professional director. But an acting coach, that would be a wonderful resource to have. Somebody who is not directing the play but can think through the process with one, can talk about techniques that might be useful, operative words that are being missed, breathing at certain points rather than other points, that might have ideas for shaping the process as much as the product. That would be a good person. And of course, one's friends are often wonderful. But I think a lot of that debriefing is what actors do to cool down. I think that's why people retreat to the bar after the performance. Although the conversation degenerates quickly.
Yes, and something that we reflected on in our Actors Health and Wellbeing survey was this recognition that the cool down often is, as you say, the drinks at the bar and so on. And we both Ian and I really wanted to honor that important regrounding, reconnecting with real people, kind of taking off the mask and finding your own ongoing persona and place in the world, where we saw the challenge was that the drinking part, if that becomes habitualized and becomes then an addictive quality, then there's a trap there. But that's for another conversation, I think. But I think it is. I was wondering, and conscious of the time, but we'll keep to our hour and a half. But I must ask you, were there moments in, say, your psychotherapeutic conversation where you either thought or your therapist thought, I wish I understood more about this acting thing? That, as you said, that there's a point where a coach, if they were trained in, say, counseling skills, would they have a value add in the sense they already understand the craft of acting in a way that a psychotherapist needs to be educated? Do you have any thoughts or experience of that?
I think that's very true. Yes, because it can get very specific, and then you have to spend time educating the therapist about what you're really talking about. I didn't, because my issue at this point was very specific. I didn't feel the need to do that kind of work. That I could sort of do it for myself once I heard what I was saying. But yes, a coach trained in acting or trained in the theater, who had psychotherapeutic skills or at least counseling abilities, and was a compassionate listener would be very valuable indeed.
And might that also apply potentially to acting teachers, if I may ask that provocation?
Absolutely. Yeah, no. And I think that is very much who I've become in my work at Denison, is someone who has a grounding in the theater and in education, but who often listens in a sort of very focused way to the subtext.
Yes, indeed. And we actually have a language around that, because drama is about understanding or seeking to understand human beings, what it means to be human. So,
and occasionally I work with someone who is acting out, right?
Yes.
we have metaphors that use performance to describe behavior that is not theatrical. We have an expression in the US, perhaps you have it too in Australia. We talk about keeping the drama on the stage. And the drama of everyday living, that's what might go to the therapist's office, but we try and keep the real good stuff for the stage.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. Well, Cheryl, just before we conclude our time, I'd like to just draw attention to the publication and just display it on screen for everyone in case you haven't seen it before. I've been talking about it over the last 7 weeks now, about Performance, the Lives of Actors. And if you click on the orange button there, you can order your copy of issue 13, which features Cheryl's article that you've heard her talk about, as well as all the other articles that we've been covering in this series of webinars. So please take up that offer, and I trust you'll find some great value in all the articles, and you can order as a PDF or as a hard copy. And the other thing to draw your attention to is that next week, as I mentioned previously, I think last week, we unfortunately haven't been able to have our presenters talk about another chapter in the book on the experience of being in the zone or being in the flow as an actor. So I've thought, why not let you learn a bit more about me? So I've invited Dr. Lisha Troughton, a good friend and research colleague of mine, to actually interview me next week, entitled Taking Care of Your Vulnerability as an Actor. And I'll be sharing with her what's been my journey to bring me to be so passionate about the health and well-being of actors, and in particularly around the themes of vulnerability and resilience. It actually will follow on from the discussions we've had today. I've had with Cheryl, and Cheryl was one of the people whose work I read that inspired some of the work that I did in my thesis. So it's delightful to be able to link these two today. So you can register there for next week's webinar. So Cheryl, it's been great to have you. Thank you for your time.
It's been wonderful to see you.
Yes, likewise. And thank you for your honesty and your openness, both in the article and today. I really appreciate it.
Well, thanks for giving me the forum.
Pleasure. Yeah. So for everyone, I'm going to now sign off till next time we meet, and just close the session with a reminder of next week's theme. So until then, take care and bye for now.